Mr.
Speaker, in December 2018, the UN Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner sent a letter to this government asking that the construction of the Site C dam be stopped until prior informed consent was given to the project by First Nations. The Site C dam had large opposition to it from all the First Nations in the regions. But after it was approved by the provincial government, a number of First Nations conceded. Conceding is not giving consent. And there are two First Nations who are fighting this in the courts right now. This government has promised that they would implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and Article 32 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People states the following: Indigenous people have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and other resources. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with Indigenous peoples concerned through their own representative institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of minerals, water, or other resources. In the speech to the throne, it dedicated walking the road of reconciliation, highlighting that since 2015, the government promised a new relationship with Indigenous people. And yet on December 13th of 2019, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination through the High Commissioner's Office published an early warning and urgent action procedure to this government, urging the government to suspend 3 projects now that neglect the rights of Indigenous people: the Site C dam, the Trans Mountain Pipeline extension, and the Coastal GasLink, until these projects obtain free, prior, and informed consent by all Indigenous people affected. Now, I'd like to just remind the government of the Delgamuukw decision. We have under our Constitution, Section 35 of the Constitution, that Aboriginal rights and title are affirmed. And in the Delgamuukw decision, it was hereditary chiefs who were the plaintiffs in that case. It was not the elected band councillors that are, part of this Indian Act system that was created through colonization. The band councillors have a role to play. The chiefs and councillors have a role to play. They are a legitimate form of government. But it is the hereditary chiefs that are recognized in the Constitution and in the Supreme Court decisions. And the Silcotin decision reaffirms that it must be the First Nations who determines how Aboriginal rights and title are determined. So the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination is calling upon Canada to immediately cease construction of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project until all permits until free, prior, and informed consent is obtained by the Secwepemc people. Immediately suspend construction of the Site C dam until free, prior, and informed consent is obtained from West Moberly and Prophet River First Nations, and immediately halt the construction and suspend all permits and approvals for the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline in traditional and unceded lands and territories of the Wet'suwet'en people until they grant their free and prior informed consent. And they proposed an alternate route for that pipeline. They're also calling on the government to pull back the RCMP and to ensure that the RCMP do not use force to go against these Indigenous First Nations, the hereditary chiefs, and their decision to affirm their rights and sovereignty over their land.
The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to address the question by the Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith regarding the Site C project. In the fall of 2014, the former government approved the project and set legally binding conditions with which the proponent must comply. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada conducts inspection activities to verify that BC Hydro is in compliance with conditions included in the Environmental Assessment Decision Statement. And when necessary, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada will undertake enforcement actions to bring BC Hydro back into compliance with these conditions. The Impact Assessment Act creates a new, fairer, and more balanced system for reviewing and approving major projects, something that is vitally important for growing our economy, for protecting the environment, and for improving the quality of life for all Canadians. Our government is committed to building a renewed nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples that is based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership, Mr. Speaker. And our government notes the efforts of BC Hydro at Site C to mitigate potential impacts, including on-site housing and recreation for workers, mental health and addiction programming, and funding for childcare and not-for-profits that focus on vulnerable populations, including Indigenous women and girls. We recognize that consultation with Indigenous peoples is not simply a legal duty. It is the honorable way for us to build relationships and work towards reconciliation, Mr. Speaker. We continue to engage in discussions with Indigenous leaders on how we can work together on issues related to consultation, environmental protection, and natural resource development. Our government is committed to ensuring Indigenous peoples have the opportunity to express their views, meaningfully participate, and contribute to this ongoing dialogue, Mr. Speaker. In closing, I want to ensure the House and my honourable colleague that we will honour our commitments to Canadians. We will work with Canada's Indigenous peoples and other interested parties to achieve results for all Canadians and for generations to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There were approvals by the prior government for this project, the Site C project, but the other parts of that approval were done by this Liberal government. After meeting with the West Moberly and Prophet River nations for a whole 20 minutes, and they had asked for this project to be stopped. We also know right now that the RCMP have a detachment 30 kilometers off the beaten trail where they are preparing to enforce an injunction for a pipeline that was given an alternative route by the hereditary chiefs. And I am calling on this government and the government of British Columbia to come to the table to negotiate with First Nations in good faith and to call off the RCMP. This cannot be another black eye on Canada. The action that was taken by the RCMP last year was really a black eye on Canada, and it's a difficult position to put the RCMP in enforcing an order for a political failure. Let's get to the table and deal with First Nations.
Well said.
Secrétaire parlementaire du ministre de l'Environnement.
The Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
His dedication and his passion for this issue, it is evident in the way that he delivers remarks in this House. Mr. Speaker, our government is serious about changing the relationship Canada has with Indigenous peoples, and I'd like to reassure my colleague and all members of this House. The Crown will execute its consultation and accommodation obligations in accordance with its constitutional and international human rights obligation, including Aboriginal and treaty rights. We're committed to making sound decisions based on science and traditional knowledge. We understand that Indigenous peoples have unique knowledge about the local environment, traditional lands, and resource, and this knowledge is recognized as an important part of project planning, resource management, and impact assessment. And I want to thank my honourable colleague once again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I wish everyone a wonderful evening.
Alors,